Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Copeland, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today. Hi, Alex.
Hello, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm very, very excited to be here.
Oh, good. We're excited to have you. This is Alex Kingsley. They are a sci-fi and fantasy author. And jump in and tell us, what is your most recent publication?
Yeah, so I actually have my debut novel coming out October 15th. It is called Empress of Dust. It is a science fantasy story. It takes place in a future where this environmental disaster called the Great Quakes has caused a lot of human civilization to sink into the ground and a lot of creatures to evolve into these like crab monsters. And there's only one human city left in the world. And it follows a story of a boy who gets lost in the desert and has to befriend the crab creatures in order to survive.
Interesting take. So you say science fantasy. Describe that for me.
Yeah, so science fantasy is that fun genre that blends science fiction and fantasy. There's a lot of science fiction aesthetics to this story. I mean, I think a lot of times when we are looking at futuristic societies, we put that in the sci-fi genre. But there are a lot of aspects of the story that are much more fantasy than they are sci-fi. Sci-fi is often, at least, I mean, plenty of people have many opinions on what is fantasy and what is sci-fi. The way that I personally define it is sci-fi is something that extrapolates on our current capabilities and says, what if we were able to take this technology and go further with it? There is a logic within the story in terms of how we got from our present to that future. It's not necessarily the future, but there is a logic for where these speculative elements come from. Whereas in this story, the crabs, they're called desert walkers in the story. They have their own society. They have their own magic system. They have their own like kinds of communication that we can't comprehend. I wanted them to be these creatures that are kind of ineffable, that almost feel as if they have evolved past humans. Like the core of the idea is the concept of carcinization, that the crab is the ideal evolutionary form, that everything is going to evolve into crabs eventually. So I want to take that and like run with it to this extreme, where not only has everything evolved physically into crabs, but they have also evolved beyond our current comprehension. They have healing capabilities where they are functionally immortal and they can communicate telepathically, like all of these things that feel much more fantasy because they're not grounded in any kind of scientific development within the world.
Right. Yeah. My husband is a hard sci-fi fan, and he will be like, no, that's fantasy. And if you put too much hard sci-fi in a book for me, I'm like, okay, skim.
I'm exactly the same. I am not a big hard sci-fi person. I know that a lot of people are, and that's why I like to be clear that this is science fantasy. Please don't be expecting anything technical or anything that is based in the rules of our reality, because it is very intentionally a reality with different rules.
Right. Fun. And so do I gather the main character is this boy that gets lost and has to befriend these crabs?
Yes. So part of this society is that they rely on scavenge technology, which to them is ancient and to us is the technology they currently use. So scavengers will go out into the desert and into the remains and try to bring back what they can and sell it. And our main character is on this scavenging team called the Ivies. They all have kind of like code names because desert scavengers die so often, they don't want to use their real names so they don't get too attached to each other. And they're all named after ancient brands. So brands that we have today because brands no longer exist in this world. So they are the brand of school, Ivies, and our protagonist is Harvard.
Ooh, very cool. How did you come up with this idea?
Which part of it?
Okay, so the crabs. I mean, I look at a crab and I don't think, oh, I want to be a crab one day. I mean,
Uh,
some people may think crabs are beautiful, but
I mean, I've certainly come to appreciate crabs a lot more over the course of writing this novel. My fascination with crabs started when I read The Time Machine at, I believe, age 12. I have always been, ever since I could read and comprehend sci-fi, I have loved sci-fi. And once I was 12, I was like, okay, time to read the classics. We're reading The Time Machine. And I thought it was fine. I wasn't super into the main story. But then we got to the very end where he jumps way too far forward in time and there are giant crabs. And then he goes back to the present. And I was like, whoa, hold on, roll back. Why did we spend the whole time with humanoids when we could have spent this whole story with the giant crabs in the future? Why did we just skip over that? Like I was furious at H.G. Wells for depriving me of the giant crabs. So I kind of had this promise to myself that one day I would explore my own giant crabs. And then as I got older, I learned about the concept of carcinization, which has kind of become a bit of a meme. Like it was something that always made me laugh, like the idea that the crab is God's perfect creature. But I also found it really fascinating. So I just decided to run with it.
fun. And so supposedly have these crabs been living underground the whole time and humans didn't know until we had this big problem with our Earth?
It's never specified because a lot of the records of the actual like cataclysm have been lost because so much was destroyed so fast. So humanity doesn't entirely know what happened anymore, how we got to this point, or even how long it has been since the quakes occurred.
Okay. So they're not even counting time. They're just day by day.
Yeah, I mean they have started counting time by this point, but they don't know how long since because it was such a long recovery process to like there
Right.
was catastrophe and then there was rebuilding of society. They're kind of piecing things together and they also are piecing information about the past together through the things that they find and that they scavenge. So a lot of pieces of pop culture and social ideas, religion, gender, a lot of these things have kind of taken a new shape as humanity has reinvented itself. So religion looks very different in this world, gender looks different in this world. All of these social constructs, things that we take for granted in our reality, a lot of things have just been forgotten, which is why the ancient brands are like this thing of the past. There's only 6 corporations now, and they are good and benevolent and make life perfect. And of course, they can do no wrong.
That sounds like it's tipping to something that may be too good to be true. So is that maybe a spoiler that we don't need to know more about that, but maybe
If you're interested in whether or not the corporations really have our best interest in mind, you can pick up the book and find out.
And are these crabs feared? Do people fear them or do they worship them?
They fear them.
Okay.
So the only human city, the city of Bastion, is walled off from the rest of the desert that they called the Dusts. And they spread these ideas that the crabs are evil, the crabs are dangerous, the crabs want to kill us. If you go out there, you will die instantly. They are our enemies. We stay in here. And part of what the story is about is discovering that the narratives that we tell are not necessarily aligned with the truth.
Interesting. So the boy goes out and well, we won't ruin the end of the story, but anyway, this is so exciting. I did see that you wrote some other books. Do you want to talk about those and how you got started as an author?
Yeah, sure. So my other book I had come out last year was The Strange Garden and Other Weird Tales, and this is a short story collection, my first ever short story collection. And it is a few stories that I had published in various places, and then some that were completely new that I just really wanted to put out there. And it's a combination of sci-fi and fantasy and horror, a little bit of magical realism. I like to dabble in a lot of different speculative things. And something I love about short stories is that it gives me this opportunity to take a concept and explore it in this small form. Also, uh, I mainly write short stories in first person as opposed to novels I often write in third person because in a short story, I only really want to have one perspective and I want to get really deep in that perspective and really deep in that voice because I have a lot of fun playing with character voice. So short stories also give me this opportunity to dive really deep into one character voice, stick with that character, explore this concept, and then be done with it and move on to the next one. So that's The Strange Garden. In terms of how I got started, I always wanted to be a writer. I was writing stories ever since I can remember. When I first started actually pursuing a career path, like when I chose my major in college, I actually was going more the playwriting direction, and I still do write plays. I really enjoy it. But I started to realize that there are different reasons to choose different mediums. Certain stories I come up with, I'm like, this benefits from being on stage in front of an audience and having actors and directors make certain choices and interpretations. Whereas some stories, I'm like, I don't think this would work in front of an audience. And I want to have control of the details in the narrative. I want to be very specific about what things look like and how things are said and how people feel. I don't want to leave that room for interpretation, and I want to have this full story set in stone and be able to give it to readers. And obviously, readers do interpretation of their own. There's no possible way to say, this is the story and this is the only way you can interpret it. If you do, I think you're closing the door on a lot of fun interpretations of your work. But I've noticed that sometimes I come up with a concept and it really wants to be a play, or it wants to be just audio, or it wants to be a novel, or it wants to be a short story, or it wants to be a game.
Fun. It was interesting to me that you talked about writing your short stories in first person and then your novels in, I guess, third person. I can never write a short story and let them go. Like if I write a short story, I'm gonna fall in love with the character, and then there's gonna be a book series coming. So everyone I write, that's happened with. So, but you kind of just like fold them up and let them go, and they're done.
It really depends on the story. Like I have one protagonist who I followed through a lot of stories. I created her for, I believe this first story I wrote with her was called The Things I Made, which was published in an anthology called Strangely Funny. And the protagonist was an unemployed artist named Eleanor McLean, who just keeps accidentally finding herself getting involved in these like eldritch horror situations. But she has such bad social anxiety that she cares way less about the fact that there's suddenly a demon in her living room and more about, oh God, the demon is judging me because I haven't cleaned in weeks and my room is such a mess, That was like Eleanor's whole thing. And I loved her so much that I brought her back for a few other stories. And she's actually the protagonist of The Strange Garden, the titular story of the collection. So there are certain characters that I come back to, some characters I was ready to let go of. Definitely the darker stories. I was like, I can only stay in this world for a certain amount of time. But there have definitely been cases where I've written a short story and I've been like, I want you back. Recently, I wrote a short story that I really loved the cast, but I was having a hard time with the plot. So I set it aside and I started writing a new novel, the one I'm currently working on. And I was like, oh, let me pull in the cast from that short story. And that short story can just be backstory for the novel. So definitely, I do get attached to short story characters, and they will show up again.
Fun. So is your audience YA or adult, or does it depend on the story?
It depends on the story. I would say that it's in that in-between spot of like YA new adult.
Okay.
I certainly think that a YA audience could enjoy and appreciate Empress. I also think that an adult audience would enjoy Empress. The characters are around like 19, 20, 21. They're
Okay.
like in that age of like, okay, I'm not a child anymore, but also I'm still navigating the world as very new to this whole autonomy thing.
Fun. And in the Great, you said the Great Empress was the name of the book that's coming out, right?
The book that's coming out is Empress of Dust.
Empress of Dust. See, I messed that up already. Sorry. So Empress of Dust. So is age the same in their time? I mean, is 2020 like 20 is, I mean, is being age 20, sorry, is being age 20 the same as being age 20 for us? Because I know if you have like a really hard society, a lot of times people grow up at an earlier age.
Yeah, and it really depends on where you are in society. Because you're totally right that the people who are struggling a little bit more, there's huge amounts of economic disparity in this world. And that is something that is explored a lot in the novel because the characters come from different economic backgrounds. The characters who are struggling more are expected to grow up faster. Like two of our protagonists became desert scavengers when they were 16.
Yeah.
But that's not the case for all of them.
So a little bit harder life, but it does sound like you do have that whole social structure of the have and the have nots, and they've developed a government, I'm assuming, too.
Yes.
Okay, neat. Very cool world building. And is it a warmer environment, or do we have climate change and those types of things?
Yeah, it's never specified directly if the reason that we're in this like hot, arid desert climate is because of climate change. If the Great Quakes are connected to climate change, I kind of like to leave that open-ended and up for interpretation. But it is definitely a hostile, hot environment, and they don't have seasons in the same way that we do.
Okay. And so will this be part of a series?
Yes, it will. This is the first of the Bastion cycle. And I already have, I know exactly where it goes, where it ends, all of that. And I am really excited to share what comes next. I mean, I'm really excited to share the first one, but so I'm already like holding myself back from giving world details that would spoil what is to come.
Right, right. You can't. I mean, if you talk about the second book, then you might be able to guess where the first book ends. So, right. And why is it called the Bastion Cycle?
Because Bastion is the name of the last human city because they view themselves as the last bastion of humanity.
Okay, interesting. Fun.
They have this sort of creation myth. There's a lot of folklore in Bastion that we delve into in the book. Every section of the book starts with an excerpt from a text about Bastion folklore. And because Bastion was founded as this community of scientists that were originally supposed to stop the Great Quakes, failed at doing that, and then had to rebuild society, they have this notion that, they're putting reason first. They are descended from scientists, and therefore they are very rational people. And because they were the most rational, they were kind of like the chosen people to survive. And naturally, that is sort of a myth that gets questioned and explored as we understand more about this society and how it works.
That sounds super fun. I'm putting out on my TBR list.
Yay! That's a win for me.
And are you going with audio as well?
Yes, it's going to be an audiobook.
Okay. Yay! That's my favorite medium right now. So
I'm a huge audiobook listener. So that was one of my number one things is I need to make sure there's an audio format.
And you said this book was a little bit of a takeoff on not getting enough of the Krabs and H.G. Wells, what other authors do you like to read?
Oh my goodness. Where do I start? Well, for number one, Brandon Sanderson has been a huge influence on me. I really, really love the Stormlight Archive, and I love the giant crabs in the Stormlight Archive. That was another thing where I was like, oh, he's doing some really fun stuff with that. I want to do my own giant crabs. And particularly Sanderson's attention to detail when it comes to world building has been a really big touchstone for me. I listened to all his lectures, that lecture series that is up for free online, and have been using my notes for that to guide my world building process. I've started writing a world book for every fictional world that I write in, things like that. But there's definitely, I had a whole list of inspirations for this book, and now I'm blanking on them.
We can come back to that.
It can be edited.
No, I get the same way. Like I'm talking, though. Wait, I have no clue.
Where did it come from? When I first started writing it, I had just freshly read the 5th season. I think they are very different books with very different focuses, so I wouldn't say that they are similar, but that energy and setting was something that I really had in mind. And I had also recently read, and this is strange because it is such a different genre from Empress, but I had recently read Six of Crows. And I really liked the found family aspect. I really liked the multi-perspective narrative, that it's third person, but we're getting different third person limited perspectives with a very close narrative distance. I found that really juicy. And I like the heist. I like a good heist. And there may be a heist involving crabs.
There may be. Ooh. That sounds like a lot of fun. So you said I didn't even know Sanderson did the world building things. I'm like, wait, I have to get into that. Yeah. But so is your background in writing? Oh, you said you do playwriting for your degree, correct? Okay. Okay, so this is one of my favorite questions for authors. I don't know if you're prepared. If you listen to several of my podcasts, you may be. But if there's one thing that you want your reader to get from, we'll pick your current or the story that's coming out, Empress of the Dust, what would that be? One experience or idea or theme or?
Yeah. I really want readers to examine with me the question of what it means to be monstrous. I think that we have a lot of great monster stories that involve this idea of questioning, well, what if the humans were the monsters all along? And while I think that is a step, I also think for me that is too simplistic of a question to be asking. People always say like, oh, well, actually Frankenstein is the monster because Victor is the real villain. And I'm like, okay, cool, I'm with you there. But what is monstrousness at its core? It is setting aside a set of traits that for some reason is seen as undesirable and to be feared and is repulsive. But at the same time, in order for something to be repulsive and scary and threatening, there needs to be a sense of allure to it as well. I think that part of what makes horror horrific is that there is also a kind of excitement and interest. I mean, if horror was purely horror, we would not have horror as a genre. We would not be interested in watching it. But there is something very exciting and interesting about the things that we consider to be monstrous. So already there is a contradiction just within that concept, and that's already juicy. But then there's also the idea of, well, what do we consider to be a deviation from the norm? What do we consider to be monstrous. And obviously, in the context of the book, we have on one level the desert walkers, who the humans have deemed monstrous. But on another level, we have 4 protagonists who have all ended up on the outskirts of society. They've all ended up as desert scavengers, which is like the lowest rung on the social ladder. So for a variety of reasons, and the book is kind of non-chronological, so as we go, we see bits and pieces of the past of each of these characters. They have all ended up here because for whatever reason, they see themselves as monstrous. They see themselves as outcasts in society in some way. That is connected to this idea that their code names essentially are all connected to these institutions that we associate with success and social prowess, when in fact, they feel that they have failed society and society has failed them. So there's a sort of irony there. But also, I think monstrousness is a particularly exciting concept to queer and trans people, because we have often been made to feel monstrous. And I know that growing up, when I didn't understand myself, I didn't understand my sexuality, I didn't understand my gender, there was a lot of self-loathing and difficulty to understand what was going on with me. So that is another layer, which is why it's so important that Harvard is a trans protagonist, because even though that is not a huge plot point in the story, it was very important to me that that was something that is brought up and becomes very significant to the story and where it goes. And all of these pieces are connected to this central question of, can monsters even exist if we change our definition of what it means to be a monster?
That's really interesting. I was just on a panel last week. I probably shouldn't say this because it's going to air live in a couple of weeks for BookFest. But and our topic was monsters and how do you make monsters and what makes a monster, and really looking at, monsters are sometimes morally gray, and it really depends on your perspective. Because if you get from the monster's perspective, then they're the hero in their own stories for their own reasons, right? And the people that are heroes to them may be the villains and or monsters. So it was fun to talk about that with some other authors.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I would love to see that panel.
Go to it's online. It's viewing the 27th, but the whole book fest is the 26th and 27th. They're online panels and they're live, and authors are going to be there answering questions. So if people, I'm going to be on my panel when it goes, so I can answer questions live if people have questions. But so I think it's going to be a really cool event.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. Tell us where we can find you and your book coming up October 15th, 2024. So this may air after October 15th. Keep that in mind.
So you can get the book on Amazon. You can find it on the publisher's website. The publisher is Space Wizard Science Fantasy. You can find me at alexkingsley.org. You can find my social medias on Instagram. I'm Hitchhiker's Guide to the Alexy. On pretty much everything else, Mastodon, Blue Sky, TikTok, I am Alexy Quest, like Galaxy Quest, but with my name.
I like that. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for being here. And yes, definitely we'll have you back when you release your next book.
I would love that. Thank you so much. This has been...
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Finding the Magic podcast. I'm your host, author and podcaster Tricia Copeland, and I love getting behind the scenes. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe and stop in each week to discover new authors and books. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep finding the magic.